just unmute. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Certainly New Zealand time. We want to welcome back today our Pastor Barry Hodson. And today on the Soapbox, we want to discuss the biblical subject of the city of God, as it is called in the Bible. And Barry, you've written a book called The City of God, Literal or Symbolic. Just lead us into the subject, Barry, by explaining what we're actually referring to and why the title Literal or Symbolic.
Well, I believe the city of God is referring to that. It's referring to a city, and there are a number of references to it, several in the Epistle to the Hebrews, and also several in the book of Revelation. I'll just read them to you, just short statements. In Hebrews 11, verse 10, we read that by faith Abraham, who was living in tents, he looked for a city. Those of you that know the history of Abraham will know that he was called by God into the promised land, and there were many cities in the land, cities of the Canaanites, people who were idolaters. Abraham didn't want to live with them. He didn't want to be in their cities. He wasn't led to build a city of his own. He wanted to remain a sojourner living in a tent because he believed that God would one day provide a city. And so it says that he was living in tents looking for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. We know that he was looking to inherit the country, to inherit the land as an everlasting possession, but we're informed here that he was also looking for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Then a little further on in Hebrews 12, verse 22, we read there that the Christian's hope, or the prospect that the Christian has before them, is to come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels. We'll come back to that later, but the connection here with an innumerable company of angels with the city of God is rather interesting, because we read in the book of Revelation that the angels number 10,000 times 10,000. That's 100 million angels. So that if they are connected with the city here, one would expect it have to be a very large city. Hebrews 13, verse 14 says, "For here," that is in Jerusalem, because it is believed the Hebrews to whom this letter was written, the Christian Hebrews, their church was in Jerusalem. "For here in Jerusalem we have no continuing city," that is, no lasting city. They knew from what Jesus said it was going to be destroyed by the Romans, but it says, "We seek one to come." So again here it's talking about the expectation of a city to come. That is the city whose builder and maker is God. And then you have in Revelation 3, verse 12, a reference to the city of God, again referred to as the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven. It comes down out of heaven, not built by man upon this earth, but it comes down from heaven, from above. And then Revelation 21, verse 2, John says there, "I saw it. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven." Now, you've asked the question, why the title Literal or Symbolic? That was the original title of the book. That we actually changed the title, The City of God, Literal, not Symbolic, because the more we thought about this, the more we studied it, the more we tended to come to the conclusion that it's not symbolic, that it is actually a literal city.
Right, so I would mention at this point, if anyone's interested in reading the book, it is available on our website, which is BibleTruthRestored.org. That's BibleTruthRestored.org. You can download the PDF. So, Barry, due to the city of God being mentioned in the book of Revelation, And of course, the book of Revelation is extremely symbolic. It is common, in Christian circles to regard the city as symbolic and not in fact referring to a literal city. So what evidence would you bring to bear to show that in fact the city is literal?
I think for a starter, when you go back to that statement in Hebrews 11, 9 to 10, where it says that Abraham was living in tents, but he looked for a city, I think you can see in that there is a contrast between two different types of accommodation. There's a contrast between a tent and a city. And the way I read that is that, well, Abraham is living, he's accommodated in a tent, but he's actually looking forward to living in and being accommodated in a city. To me, the statement really conveys literality, a literal place where he will live or be accommodated. Also, in Revelation 21 and 22, which refers to the city, the New Jerusalem, reference is made there, if you read it through, reference is made to the city having walls, having gates, angels guarding the gates. It's got streets, one street in particular. It's got a river in it. It's got a tree of life in it. The throne of God is referred to as being in it. All these references convey to me a literal city. Now, in Revelation 21, verse 16, we're told there the angel measured the city. He measured the city and it was 12,000 furlongs. Now, 12,000 furlongs is 1,500 miles or 2,400 kilometers. And it was a 4-square cubical city. Now, in ancient times, when the measurement of a city was given, it was the circumference of the city that was given. That is the distance around it. That's usually what was conveyed by measuring a city. So being 4 square, what you need to do, of course, is to divide the 1,500 miles or 2,500 kilometers. You divide it by 4 because it says that the length and the breadth and the height were equal. And if you divide that measurement by 4, you end up with a building or a city 375 miles square or 600 kilometers square. Now, I got to say that I'm yet to come across a satisfactory explanation as to how this can be given a symbolic application. I know some have tried, and a lot of mental gymnastics has been exercised in order to make this symbolic. And I can only speak for myself. None of them have really gelled with me. There's been a lot of stabs in the dark in order to make this measurement symbolic, but none that I've read really make sense. They don't really convey an acceptable truth. Now, I realize that the book of Revelation has got a lot of symbol, but there is also literality mixed up. It's not all totally 100% symbol. For instance, you read about the 1,000-year reign, the millennial reign. Most expositors or students, they don't try to symbolize it or spiritualize it. They take it literally for a 1,000-year period. And I could quote other examples there as well. The same applies to this word city. There is reference in the book of Revelation to another city, a city which is actually on 7 hills and which rules over the kings of the earth. Now, in the days when the book of Revelation was given, when John was alive, that city on 7 hills that ruled over the kings of the earth, that city was Rome. And almost all expositors, in view of the fact that there's a lot of symbol in Revelation, all expositors agree it's a literal city. They have no problem taking it as a literal city. And when you read through it, you see that it's actually the seat of a harlot woman. And this harlot woman is referring to an apostate church. It's prophetic of things to come, of course. Well, I believe that the city of God is just as literal, and it will be, in fact, the seat of the Lord Jesus Christ and his bride, the church, the true church, the pure church. To me, there is a design contrast in Revelation between the two cities, the city of the impure bride and the city of the pure bride.
So in answer to that, Barry, someone might say, though, that no, it is symbolic and that the city is symbolic of the church. And I'm going to read from Revelation chapter 21, verse 2, and it says, I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, so that's what we're talking about, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. So wouldn't this seem to be that the city of God here is symbolic of the church?
Well, if you read that carefully, it doesn't say that the city is a bride. It says it is adorned like a bride. And there is a big difference, It definitely doesn't say it is the bride. It's adorned like a bride. And that's referring, of course, to the gold and the precious stones and jewels and gems that are referred to as adorning the city. Now, in biblical times, brides were adorned with jewels. For example, Isaiah 61, verse 10, actually refers to that. Precious stones also adorned Solomon's temple. You read in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 2 to 8, that during David's lifetime, he actually collected, through his victories over the enemy, he collected gold, he collected jewels, he collected gems, he collected precious stones for the temple that his son Solomon was going to build. And if you read 2 Chronicles 3, verse 6, you find that Solomon actually adorned the temple. He actually adorned the temple with these precious stones and these precious jewels. Now, Revelation itself, if you read it, it indicates that the church is quite separate, quite distinct from the city. You cannot make them one and the same thing. For example, Revelation 20, verse 9 refers to armies coming up against the camp of the saints and the beloved city. So there is a distinction made there between the city and the camp of the saints. Revelation 21, verse 27 and 22, verse 14 refers to the saints being permitted to enter the gates of the city. So here you see the church is not the city, it enters into the city. Again, a distinction made between the two. Hebrews 12, verse 22 actually makes the same distinction between the city and the church, referring to the city and the church as separate entities. And again, I say, can it really be seriously believed that when we read about Abraham living in tents and looking forward to living in a city that has foundations, whose builder is maker is God, can we really believe that the city is not a city and that it means something else or that something symbolic? I don't think so. I think that's really stretching things too much.
So Barry, you referred to the dimensions that are given there, and for our American people, 1,500 miles circumference square. For those of us on the metric system, around 2,400, 2,500 kilometres. So each side, effectively 600 kilometres, 600 kilometres, 600 by 600 around the square. But bear in mind, the dimensions given aren't just the sort of flat one-dimensional dimensions. It's as high as it is around. So we've got a city here that's, 2,400 kilometers in circumference, and being a cube as it is, it's extremely high. So Barry, can a city seriously be this big? And bearing in mind it is a cube, that is a massive cube. Surely, Barry, surely that points to the fact that it must be symbolic. It's just too big to be real.
There's no question about it. From a human point of view, And that's what we have to emphasize from a human point of view. Is the size of the city is astronomical. It's mind-boggling. And I think it is for that reason that many have not been able to accept it literally, why it's been spiritualized, or attempts have been made to spiritualize it away. But what we have to remember is this is not a city built by man. It very clearly states whose builder and maker is God. Now the question is, could God make a city that big? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Could he? Could God make a city that big? Well, if your concept of God is the same as mine, the answer is, yeah, easily. Bigger if he wants to. No question about it. Now, the question is a question I'd like to ask, leading up to some other things that I want to say. How big is heaven? Well, how big? How big? Is anybody prepared to suggest how big is heaven? As I've already said, reference is made to 100 million angels there, worshipping and gathering around the throne of God. So the throne room alone in heaven would have to be huge to accommodate 100 million angels. Here's another question. What is heaven? Have you ever thought, what exactly is heaven? Where God's throne is, where these angels, I mean, is it another planet? Is it a place? Or is it just empty space? Is it something spectral? Is it something ethereal? Or is God just sitting up there on the clouds, strumming a harp, as some, depict him? Well, as I said, God's throne is there, and he sits on the throne. So it must be a place. And of course, somebody will say, well, what has that got to do with the city of God? Well, the answer is, I believe this city of God is heaven. I believe that heaven's not another planet. It's not clouds or empty space. I believe that heaven is actually a city, a mobile city. It's not like a planet that is locked into an orbit that it can't get out of and it's restricted. It's mobile. It can go. It can traverse. God rides through the heavens. We read in Scripture, and in Ezekiel saw him being carried on his throne by the cherubim. That's why this city is so big. That's why the city is of such dazzling beauty. Reference in Revelation 22 verse 1 of God's throne being in the city, it actually says the throne is in the temple of heaven. The throne, which is seen in the city, is referred to as being in the temple of heaven, which is connecting the city with heaven. Now, in Revelation 21 verse 3, the city is referred to as the tabernacle of God. And other scriptures also refer to heaven as the tabernacle or the temple. The Old Testament has references. For example, Psalm 11 verse 4, the reference in the Old Testament to God, to heaven being God's tabernacle, of it being God's temple. Heaven is called a tabernacle, which actually literally means tent. Why? Because it's mobile, like a tent. A tent is mobile. It's not cemented into the ground. But it's also called a temple because, like a temple, it's a solid structure. It's got foundations. The main indication, I think, that this city is actually heaven itself is due to its shape. It's a cube, as you have pointed out. You know, the only other references in the Bible to a cubical structure are in relation to the most holy place in the tabernacle and in the temple. If anyone wants references that I'll give you, Exodus 26, verse 15 to 25, and 1 Kings 6, verse 19 onwards. Now that's interesting. As I say, the only other structure in Scripture besides the city of God that's referred to as a cube is the most holy place in the tabernacle and temple. Now, in the epistle to the Hebrews, we are told there very clearly that most holy place, that cubical place, represented heaven. You put two and two together, you get what I'm getting at? Somebody might say, oh, yeah, but the four-square encampment, that was the church, the Old Testament Church of Israel, the four-square encampment. So maybe that's what it's referring to. No, the four-square encampment wasn't cubical. It wasn't as high as what it was wide and broad. It wasn't a cube. Only the most holy place, which represented heaven, was a cube, and that's what the city is referred to as being God's tabernacle. It's a cube, a cubical building.
So the dimensions there clearly to people of faith shouldn't be a barrier.
No.
So it's a bit of a spurious argument to try and make it symbolic just because it's too big.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. The builder is God. There's actually something else I can think of that God made that's bigger than the city. It's called the universe.
Right.
and God actually spoke it into existence. That's how easy it is for God.
An example I've sometimes given is that, hey, you know, if we didn't have a moon and we'd never seen it, and then somebody said to you, say the moon was going to appear in the sky the next night, and you said to somebody, does anybody know how far it is around the moon? It's further than 1,500 miles, that's for sure. And if somebody said, you know, tomorrow night there's going to be this great big round object, almost like a planet, that's going to shed light on the earth at night, and it's whatever it is, whatever the distance is around, a lot of people would find that hard to believe. But I mean, we just take it our stride because it's always been there. We think nothing of it. But I mean, what's the moon? What is the moon compared to other stuff that God, even our sun is very, very small compared to other suns in the universe. You can't limit God's power or God's ability to make a city, however big he lights. I mean, it's his house. It's where his throne is. It's where he ascended.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Barry, the city, is the city millennial? In other words, does it come prior to the millennium starting at the coming of Christ and therefore exists during the 1,000-year reign on earth? Or, as some suggest, is it post-millennial? Do we not actually see the city until the 1,000-year reign is over and then after that?
I believe it's millennial. I believe the city comes when Jesus comes. For example, in Revelation there, the tree of life. The tree of life is referred to as being in the city, which implies it's a paradise. That doesn't mean to say the earth's not going to be made a paradise, because it is, but it's going to take a while to do that. But the heaven itself is a paradise. And for that reason, the tree of life is referred to as being in the middle of it. And we know from what Jesus said on the cross to the thief, when he said, Lord, remember me, when you come. Jesus said, truly I tell you, this day you shall be with me in paradise. So we know that paradise is coming at the second coming. Revelation 21 verse 14 to 15 and verse 27 states that there will be impure and unholy people outside the city who will not be allowed to enter. That is, mortal people. Well, there are going to be no mortals after the millennium. There's only going to be mortal population during the millennium. So that would indicate again that the city will be here during the time of mortals on the earth. Revelation 22 verse 2 says the leaves of the tree of life in the city will be used for healing the nations. Well, again, there'll be no nations that will need healing after the millennium. This again indicates that it's millennial. Revelation 20 verse 7 to 9 refers to nations revolting at the end of the millennium, coming up against the city to attack it. And this again would indicate that the city is here during that period. I mean, it would not be possible if the city never came until after the millennium.
So Barry, in the latter chapters of the book of Ezekiel, from sort of chapter 40 on, we read there about another temple city, and it's common to associate that with this millennial city that we've been talking about from Revelation, and effectively make them one and the same, and make this temple city that Ezekiel talks about the one where the immortal saints will live during the millennium. Where does that fit in? Can you just explain, where and how Ezekiel fits in?
Yeah, you're referring to the last, about eight chapters of Ezekiel, chapter 40 onwards.
Yeah.
In Ezekiel chapter 40, we read that the prophet Ezekiel was taken in vision to an exceedingly high mountain at Jerusalem. And it's generally accepted that this was referring to Mount Zion in the future, which is going to be very highly elevated. In fact, Isaiah 2 verse 8 is elevated above the tops of the mountains. And Zechariah 14 tells us that when Jesus returns, there's going to be an earthquake of unprecedented magnitude that's going to convulse the whole earth, actually, but the vortex will be in the Holy Land, especially at Jerusalem, and it's going to heave up the site of Jerusalem, and it's going to actually level the Judean hills. So Zion is going to be elevated to an extremely high level, possibly above the clouds, but it is going to be very high. And Ezekiel was taken in vision to that mountain, and he was on it, and he saw a structure like a city. Now, he doesn't say it was a city. He said it was like a city, because in his day, the size of the structure was such, it looked like a city. Cities weren't as big in those days as what they are today. And it turned out it was not a city, it was a temple. And the measurements are given. We're told it was 500 reeds square. It's Ezekiel 42, verse 16 to 20. Now, we read in Ezekiel 41, verse 8, a reed is 6 great cubits. A great cubit was a cubit plus an handbreadth, which was about 20 inches, 35 centimeters. So one reed would be 120 inches, that's 10 feet, or 305 centimeters. 500 reeds, which is what this structure measured, 500 reeds would be 5,000 feet, or over 1,500 meters. In other words, about a mile square. Now, just note, it's only a mile square, not 375 miles square, just a mile square. It's not the city of God that we've been talking about, referred to, and totally different. It's not cubical either. It's not the same height as it is length and breadth. And Ezekiel 40 verse 2 says it was on the south side of the mountain, on the south side of Mount Zion. So then this 1 mile square temple is not the cubical city that we're reading about in Revelation, into which the immortal saints are going to enter, and where the angels are. It's not that. No, Ezekiel's temple is not for immortals, it is for mortals. It is a place for mortals to worship, and there's no immortals referred to. You can read Ezekiel 40 right through to the end. There is no reference about immortals worshiping there or ministering there. Quite the opposite. The whole emphasis through all these chapters is on mortal people worshiping there and ministering there. Now, I just want to give you a few quotes from Ezekiel to indicate to confirm the mortality of those who are involved in this temple. Ezekiel 44 verse 9 says that no male uncircumcised in flesh will be allowed to enter the sanctuary. Well, I mean, we all know physical circumcision was not a condition of entry into the church of Christ or to the city of God. Never was, never will be. Ezekiel 43, verse 18 to 27, and Ezekiel 44, verse 15 to 16 says, Jewish priests, the sons of Zadok, offer animal sacrifices in this temple. Now, I think it's generally accepted these animal sacrifices won't be required to atone for sin, because Christ's sacrifice is all embracing, is totally efficacious to do that. I think it's generally accepted these animal sacrifices, being offered during the millennium when Jesus has actually returned, they are retrospective offerings. They are offerings for mortals to acknowledge and to memorialize the sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ. But there's no reference, you'll notice, no reference to animal sacrifices, to blood, or to death in the city of God where the immortals are. Ezekiel 44, verse 18 and verse 21 says that the priests, the sons of Zadok, are not allowed to wear anything that causes sweat, and they're not allowed to enter the service of God drunk. They are clearly mortal people. They really are. I mean, it would be incongruous to imagine immortals sweating or getting drunk. Ezekiel 44, verse 25 refers to the sons of Zadok having sons and daughters, which implies marriage. Again, Jesus made it very clear that immortals don't marry and won't be having children. Ezekiel 44, verse 25 to 27 says the priest will be defiled by contact with a dead person, not allowed to enter into this temple service till a 7-day period of ritual cleansing takes place. Well, again, hardly applicable to immortal saints. The reference here to dead persons clearly indicates the mortality of the people that are involved in that particular temple. So Ezekiel's temple, I believe, is very clearly only for mortal worshippers, and its service is conducted by mortal priests, the sons of Zadok, descendants of Aaron, and other scriptures relate to this. You see, we read in Zechariah 14, verse 16, that everyone who survives from the nations which attack Jerusalem shall go up, that is, go up to Jerusalem from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts. So there are going to be survivors of Armageddon in all the nations around the world, and they are going to make annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem to worship. The question is, where are they going to worship? Well, in Ezekiel's temple, of course, which is referred to as the house of the Lord in Isaiah 2. Let me read it to you. It'll come to pass in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established, as the top of the mountain shall be exalted above the hills. All nations shall flow into it. Many people will go and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now, that's not referring to immortal worshippers going up to worship. Immortal worshippers won't be needing to go up there for the Lord to teach them his ways. They already know his ways. It's because they know his ways and believe his ways that they become immortal and get into the city of God. This is clearly mortal population here. Isaiah 66, verse 23 also says, from one new moon to another, from 1 month to another, from one Sabbath to another, from 1 week to another, shall all flesh, mortal population, shall all flesh come to worship before me, says the Lord. And just one other quote from Zechariah 8, verse 20 to 23, many people and strong nations, superpowers, Russia, America, whoever, the survivors, they're going to come and seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to pray before the Lord. Now, at this point, a question might be asked, well, whereabouts are all these worshippers, these mortal worshippers coming up from all the nations. Where on earth are they going to be accommodated? I mean, they've got to stay somewhere. They've got to sleep somewhere. They've got to be fed somewhere. Whereabouts? Are they going to be in Ezekiel's temple? No, because it's a temple. It's not a city. It's not a place to accommodate people from all the nations. It's a city. Only the sons of Zadok, only the priests reside there. Well, we say, will these mortal worshippers be accommodated in the city of God, referred to in Revelation 21? Hardly. No. Only the immortal saints and the angels are there. Where then will these mortal worshippers stay? Well, in Ezekiel 48, verse 16, reference is made there to another city. Another city, this one, the measurements are also given. It's 4,500 cubic square. That's 1.5 miles square, or 2.5 kilometers square. And it's situated about 24 kilometers, 15 miles south of Jerusalem, in the area of Hebron. And a name is given to us, not New Jerusalem. The name is Yahweh Shammah, which means the Lord is there. It's believed, I believe, the mortal worshippers who are going to come up from all nations to worship the Lord in Ezekiel's temple, they will be accommodated in that particular city. So putting two and two together, you can see from all this, there are going to be two cities and there are going to be two temples. The reason I say two temples is because the city of God is not just a city, it is actually a city temple. Revelation 21 verse 22 says, John says, and I saw no temple therein. That is, he says, I didn't see a temple inside the city. Why? Because the city is all temple and the Lord is worshipped everywhere in it. It hasn't got some special little corner set aside like old Jerusalem. You know, we've got a certain hill set aside where the temple is. Not, City of God doesn't need a special little place set aside to have a temple. It's all temple, and the Lord can be worshipped everywhere everyone goes in that. And so I believe the mortal worshippers who come up from all nations, they will be accommodated in that city. There are two thrones involved as well. Father God's throne is in the city, that is in heaven. I've already referred to that. But there's also David's throne, which Jesus is going to restore. David's throne is in Ezekiel's temple, and it's referred to in Ezekiel 43, verse 7. And Jesus will actually sit there on that throne to give judgment on the mortal peoples and give counsel on that particular throne. But you see, because Jesus sits at the right hand of his Father on his throne, that throne is referred to not just as the Father's throne, it's referred to as the throne of God and the Lamb in Revelation 22, verse 1. It's God's throne, but it's referred to as the throne of God and the Lamb because Jesus sits on it with his Father. And because David's throne represents God's throne on earth, and Jesus sits on that, it is sometimes referred to as God's throne, and sometimes as Christ's throne. Revelation 3 verse 21 refers to the two thrones. It says, this is Jesus speaking, he says, to him who overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am seated with my Father in his throne. Two thrones. Again, Matthew 25 verse 31, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. I mean, he's on the Father's throne, but he's talking about this other throne that he's going to sit on when he comes back. And before him shall be gathered all nations. He shall separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. Just one other point. In Ezekiel 44, verse 1 to 3, reference is made there to the prince, which many regard as the Messiah. And it refers to the prince entering Ezekiel's temple by the east gate. And I imagine coming in the east gate, he will go and sit upon the throne of David that he's restored to do his business. But it also goes on to say that he leaves by the same gate. He doesn't stay in the city. He doesn't live in the temple. He doesn't live. He doesn't stay. And he comes in the east gate and then he goes out. Where does he go? Where does he go? Well, I think he goes back to the city of God, to heaven itself, which has come with him at his second coming.
Thank you very much, Barry, for all those points. And it really is a case of putting those scriptures together to sort of get the conclusion. I'd also just like to throw in there Revelation 2 verse 7. You did make reference to the tree of life, but for me, that this sort of clinches the literality of it, because we read there, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him that overcomes will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. That's the Greek paradisos, literally means a park or a garden city. And when you read about the city of God later on in chapter sort of 21 and 22, as you say, you've got this beautiful crystal, you've got the river of life, you've got the tree of life there on either side of the river. It's a beautiful garden city. That's what paradise is. That's what the city of God is. That's what heaven is. And it talks about how we're going to eat of the tree of life, which is in that city. Now, where else do we learn about the tree of life? It's back in Genesis, isn't it? And no one would argue that Genesis with Adam, Eve, the tree of life, the serpent, no one would argue that was just a symbolic reference. Right. Everyone is happy to accept that's literal. There was a literal Adam, a literal Eve, a literal, forbidden fruit tree, a literal tree of life that they got prevented from eating. And then in Revelation, we have this tree of life back in the city of God. So if the tree of life is literal, the city where it's sitting in surely must be literal as well, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if anybody's got any questions at this point. You can feel free to actually unmute and ask in person if you'd like anything clarified. If not, I would suggest go away and have a look at the scriptures that Barry's mentioned today, and also have a look at the book. Again, the website BibleTruthRestored.org, and you'll see, you can search for the title, City of God, you'll find it there. Have a read through a bit more in detail. And I guess, Barry, it's important because without the city of God that we've talked about being a literal place, where are the saints going to be in the millennium?
Yeah.
They've got nowhere to live, have they?
No, because the Holy Land, the Promised Land, during the millennium is actually, and Ezekiel refers to this in Ezekiel 48, the land is divided up into parallel strips for all the tribes of Israel. Yeah.
Exactly. So thank you, Barry. That's given us some food for thought. Maybe for some of you, this is a new consideration. But as the scriptures say, a wise scribe, such as our brother Barry there, brings forth out of his storehouse things old and things new. So perhaps you've never really considered this before, but just have a look at it, prayerfully study the word and see whether these things are so, just as the Bereans did. So thank you very much again, Barry. I'll hand it back to you, Guy.